Hi everyone, welcome to the third and last of my manual exposure videos. This time I want to show you some quick and simple ways to understand the numbers when it comes to the exposure triangle. Also with exposure, don't forget, don't rush, slow down and become a thinking photographer. So let's take a look at some parameters now, or should I say priorities. Let's go through the thought process first of all. Setting the first parameter, we want good quality, so let's take the ISO down to 200. We can see the image has gone darker on the screen, and I'm going to go with a relatively small depth of field, so I'm going to take the aperture down to around about f4. ISO 200, f4, that's my two parameters set. Now we can change the shutter speed to get the correct indicated exposure, maybe not the actual exposure. So where does the shutter speed end up? Well, if you're not sure, start moving the dial until you see the actual needle come into play on the meter on the left hand side of the screen there. Now nothing's happening taking the shutter speed up, so we'll go the other way and you can see the needle starts to come into play. We want to get that on the 0 point, and like I said, that's our starting point. Now at 1/10 of a second, I actually think the exposure is probably just a little bit on the bright side there, particularly for the blacks. So I'm going to adjust that down and just see how that looks. Also we can see the histogram on the right there. It's a little bit too far on the right hand side, so the highlights are a touch on the bright side. So let's bring that down, and I think probably -1 will do it, and that's a 1/20th of a second. We can see the histogram is looking much better now as well, with the highlights on the right not clipping but just over onto the right, so we're exposed to the right there. And the shadows and blacks have moved to the left a little bit. There's a little bit of clipping, and that's probably around the lens mount there, but in post-production we can open that up a little bit if we want to, that is, just with some dodging in that area. Now it is a low exposure at 1/20th of a second, but you know, at 1/20th of a second we will be shooting on a tripod, so as long as you're not handheld, there's nothing wrong with that. And that's the procedure really for all of the manual exposure. And if you think about it, if we'd wanted a higher shutter speed, then we'd have set the shutter speed as one of the priorities and then moved either the aperture or the ISO accordingly to still get that meter on the left hand side coming down to around about -1, again checking the histogram on the right. Now another option for helping with learning is to maybe work with a handheld exposure meter like I'm doing here. I'll show you 3 options. This one is my old Minolta digital one. It's about 15-20 years old, probably a lot older than that actually, still going strong. The old analog ones are a bit easier to help with learning, which I'll show you after this. But let's go with this digital option here at the moment. So let's put the ISO in, just like we did before. We're going to go down to 200. And then what we do is we actually take a reading, and then using the jog buttons on the side there, we can actually change the shutter speed to get that F number down to F4. And there it is, comes down to F4, and we can see we're at about a 1/60th of a second. But if you remember, when we was in the camera on the meter, we actually underexposed it a little bit just to get those blacks dark, which was about a 1/20th of a second. So that's at 1 1/3 stops, and we're about a 1/3 of a stop out on our reading here. So, you know, not every exposure meter is going to be exactly the same. You will have little differences. The idea is to get yourself in the ballpark and then make some judgments on where you want the tones to go, whether it's blacks, highlights, or even your mid-tones, where you want to expose for. But we'll always get somewhere in the ballpark. Not one exposure meter will be 100% accurate for your scene, unless it's 18% grey, which is what they're calibrated at. At the other end, if we wanted more depth of field, we could take this up to f16 just by shunting the exposure with the buttons, and that would bring the shutter speed down to 1/4 of a second. So still really on a tripod, but it gives us f16 and good depth of field. It's as simple as that. Now let's look at this old Western meter here that I picked up a few years ago second hand. You can get them very, very cheap, just make sure that they work fine. So I've taken a reading at 7.5, and we can see we're on ISO 200, which is on the ASA scale. But here we can look down, and there's the shutter speed and the aperture, so around about a 1/60th of a second at f4 as before, just about half a stop out. but that gives you an idea of literally how the reading works on here. The good thing is we can see all of the combinations all along these two dials now, so we can see kind of like 30th of a second, 5.6, and then going around F16 somewhere about a quarter of a second to a third of a second. So, you know, again, shunting across it makes it very easy to look at all the combinations. And now just to show you something a bit more up to date, here's a modern Zirconic version. So it has the analog dials here. You can see we've got 200 ISO and we've got the analog dials still, so 60th of a second at F4 here. And then we can see and read all of the other combinations along the dials as well. So we've got F16 at a quarter of a second there too. If you wanted F1.4, then we'd be looking down here at 500th of a second. So a really easy way to look at combinations of all the shutter speeds and the apertures, and you can just read that off much easier than maybe a digital option. If you're out and about in daylight, you can also have a play around with the Sunny 16 rule. There's a copy of that in my photo companion guide on manual exposure. This is available on Amazon as a paperback or on Kindle as well if you want to download it to your phone. So let's show you the grid for Sunny 16. It basically works on 125th of a second at 100 ISO in bright sunlight, then we're looking at F16. But there are other combinations as you can see within the grid here, so maybe have a little play around with that and see how close you can get with just estimating your exposure. Remember that any of these devices, whether it's your camera exposure meter, a handheld exposure meter, or just guessing something, they're not going to be 100% accurate. And we could say, well, which one of these meters I've just shown was the accurate one? Well, it doesn't really matter. Get in the ballpark, assess what you want out of the image, change your exposure accordingly. The great news is we've got the back of the camera and we've got that histogram just to confirm what we want. Protect those highlights, take a consideration on the shadows and the rest of the tones and where you want them to be. If you work your exposures this way, what you'll find is you'll have much less to do in the way of post-production and kind of like rescuing pictures. We don't want to rescue pictures. What we want to do is get into Photoshop or Lightroom, start assessing where we want the highlights, the shadows and those tones to be, and do some good dodging and burning just to bring the best out in the picture. I hope these 3 short videos have helped you with manual exposure. It's always a difficult area to get your head round in the beginning, but don't give up, just keep working at it. The more you work at getting the exposure triangle correct in camera and understanding what everything does, then the better your photography will be. But really don't give up. Don't think it's too much of a problem to go through all of this. Is it's too much faffing about, it slows you down. These are all good things, and you know, slowing down, thinking about your picture, that will actually make you a better photographer in the long run. I really hope you've enjoyed these, and please do remember to subscribe and hit the like button, and if you'd like to hear of more information in the future, don't forget to just hit the bell for notifications.